Donc, je vais juste rapidement présenter les intervenants. Donc, Robert Young, qui est professeur à la New York University, spécialiste des questions culturelles, postcoloniales, qui a publié de nombreux ouvrages et qui donc, avec Jean Khalfa, est à l'origine du travail extrêmement érudit sur les inédits de Fanon.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis désolé, mais je vais parler en anglais. Excusez-moi. On the day of the Marche de la Dignité à Paris contre les violences policières, a member of GST emailed the following message to the group. Chers amis, quelle émotion politique une heure avant la Marche de la Dignité d'avoir entre les mains des inédits de Frantz Fanon. Sa pensée est toujours vivante, plus que jamais. He was then seen on the march holding the weighty 600-page Fanon inédit up in the same way that others were holding up posters of Jamila Boured or Leila Khaled. Was it appropriate to link Fanon to Pire? Yes, and not only because of the desire for dignity. Fanon's political position was always that to achieve dignity fully, difference should be a matter of indifference, because difference always begins with the act of objectification. For Fanon, the way to retrieve subjectivity was not to retrieve that difference and affirm it, briefly négritude, but for difference to become a matter of indifference. And for him only that, with that, would objectification cease, and this person or subject be able to realize him or herself fully as a person. But what about those new inédits? I'm going to focus on the newly published plays of Fanon, L'œil se noie et les mains parallèles, but also tried to link them to the unpublished Écrits psychiatriques. For decades, Fanon's plays were the subject of speculation and curiosity. Now that we can read them at first sight, his extraordinary, unpredictable dramas certainly surprise us. But they surprise us most of all, perhaps, by what they don't say. They're written without any overt reference to almost anything in the world in which Fanon lived, or to contemporary politics of any kind. Composed in 1949, in the years when Fanon was studying medicine in Lyon and developing the ideas that he discusses in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, published in 1952, 3 years later, there is, most surprisingly of all, almost no reference to race. And far from being Sartrean pastiche, as his biographers, who had of course never read them, had previously assumed, the language of the plays is surrealistic and densely metaphorical in style, developed at a high level of abstraction. At first sight, indeed at second sight or even third sight, they seem almost at times impenetrable, hermetic. It's extraordinary to consider in particular that these plays were dictated as Fanon, that's how Fanon used to write, he would dictate to a stenographer. Each line spontaneously invented live, not written. And as a result of that, perhaps, they have an odd characteristic of being both abstract and immediate at the same time. Working on them for many months for our recent edition of the Inédit, I began to see ways in which they can be affiliated meaningfully to Fanon's two best-known works. Remarkably, given that they were most probably written in the same year, 1949, in their preoccupations they seem to correspond in certain ways directly to Peau Noire, but on the one hand, and Les Damnés de la Terre on the other. The two plays, as I say, are as unexpected as they are brilliant. L'œil se noie is a domestic drama centered on a conflict between two brothers who seem to closely resemble Fanon himself and Joby, his brother. François, who is the Frantz-like brother, has rejected the ordinary everyday bourgeois social world, speaks to no one except his lover, Ginette, and seems to be seeking some form of transcendence through a form of pure immanence by assimilating himself into the material universe. He seems to want to move from the human to the inhuman. The play ends with him leading Ginette to the gates of the absolute. The second, much longer and more difficult play, Les Mains Parallèles, takes the form of an Oedipal Greek tragedy in which the hero, Epithalos, kills his father, the ruler of a small island whose regime has been complicit with the oppressive power of the gods. His patricide, his regicide, unleashes death and destruction on the island, and in the final act, his mother and would-be mother-in-law remonstrate with him for his destructive, masculist, egotistical ambition, and he sacrifices himself in order perhaps to facilitate a return to some form of new order. Now, what's noticeable is that both plays involve the rejection of the status quo, while the second involves a revolutionary overturning of the current regime through the murder of the king. Little in the psychiatric or other writings that we collected for the Inédit, or indeed anything published elsewhere by Fanon before he went to Algeria, suggests any interest in revolutionary violence. But we can make a link, I think, between the themes of the play and his interest in the use of electroconvulsive therapy as a form of therapy in psychiatry, and I'll speak about that a little later. The play provides remarkable anticipation, in fact, of the later work, above all, Les Damnés de la Terre. What's unexpected or different from Damnés de la Terre, however, is that Fanon invokes Nietzsche, not Marx, in order to theorize the dynamic and rationale of the revolutionary act. Writing to his Italian editor Giovanni Pirelli in September 1963, the late François Maspero quotes Lord Claude Lanzmann's reaction to reading one of the plays of Fanon in manuscript. Lanzmann was one of the few people who actually read the plays before they'd been published. He said, "C'est une sorte de travail d'exorcisme personnel qui attend souvent une extraordinaire beauté formelle, mais n'est pas dénué d'hermétisme." I think it was a remarkably acute formulation. It's the combination of the personal exorcism with this hermetic quality. And that formulation tallies with the view of Peter Geismar, Fanon's first biographer, and Fanon's elder brother Joby, that the plays amount to an autobiographical self-interrogation and analysis. In the first, L'Oeil Noir, we can detect deep concerns about language, identity, and even race, and the ways in which these issues are played out in and through consciousness and the dynamics of interracial relationships, all of which can be directly linked to ideas explored in Peau Noire. What's significant is that unlike Peau Noire, Fanon explores these questions without foregrounding the question of race or skin color explicitly at all. In attempting that, he was in some sense, I think, putting into practice the argument being made by some today, and fundamental to the work of a critic such as Paul Gilroy, that difference should be a matter of indifference. The oppressive sense of being racialized as a minority and therefore objectified by a white society is exactly what Fanon wished to get away from. He didn't want to be marked out and regarded as different, nor to turn that projected difference into the grounds of his own social and cultural identity. He wants, we might say, to be the same, to be allowed the dignity of being ordinary, unremarkable, indifferently the same. As he writes, "Je voulais tout simplement être un homme parmi d'autres hommes. Je voulais être homme, rien que homme." L'Oeil Noir therefore explores the psychological effects of racialization without foregrounding the social milieu that's produced them, or indeed overtly discussing the question of race as such. In doing that, it positions itself as a play in terms of making all members of the audience, putting them in the situation of being the main character, François, because you can't tell colour he is. He's unidentified in terms of racial characteristics. So it repositions the audience because it doesn't just situate us as viewers in the way that some would have identified him with him or not, depending if he'd been specified as being black. Or rather, what everybody gets positioned in, the position we find ourselves, is that we're all in the position of being the in-between, of being neither and both at once, which is in fact what Fanon himself complained of exactly feeling when he was a student in Lyon. As with Fanon in Peau Noire, so François in L'Oiseau Noir seems to be caught in an irresolvable dialectical bind between being black and being white, noir and noir, past and future, body and world, desire and insentience, transcendence and immanence. The language of L'Oiseau Noir correlates directly to the visceral language of affect and its effect on the body that's so remarkable a characteristic of Peau Noire. Recall the famous analyses in chapter 5, L'expérience vécue du noir, of being pointed out in the street, or the incident in the railway carriage when a child points at Fanon and he feels his blackness precipitated into the cold whiteness of winter that surrounds him. Mon corps me revenait étalé, disjoint, rétamé, tout endeuillé dans ce jour blanc d'hiver. Alentour le blanc, en eau, le ciel s'arrache le nombril, la terre crisse sous mes pieds et un champ blanc, blanc, toute cette blancheur qui me calcine. In this whiteness that surrounds Fanon and burns his body to ashes, he becomes, in some sense, a burnt offering, a grey simulacrum of whiteness in ash. Notice the transfer of affect that takes place, so that it's the sky that is tearing at its navel. En eau, le ciel s'arrache le nombril. A transposition that magnifies the affect to give us a sense of the intensity of what he's experiencing. Subjective affect in his consciousness is objectified and made immanent, produced first in his body, but then by the material world, which isn't distinguished from, but rather presented it as if it were part of the body itself. That technique marks the distinctive use of language honed by Fanon in the plays, starting with a preoccupation with the oppressive presence of whiteness in any form or appearance. In the plays, the idiom is even more surrealistic and suffused with a desire for transcendence, which I interpret as the desire for some kind of way out of this situation. Traces of that remain in Peau Noire, and we perhaps notice them more now. At the end of chapter 5, for example, when Fanon refuses the advice of the wounded veteran in the 1949 movie Home of the Brave, French title, Je suis un nègre, the advice that he should put up with his colour the way that the veteran puts up with his amputated stump. Hier, en ouvrant les yeux sur le monde, je vis le ciel de part en part se révulser. Je voulais me lever, mais le silence éviscéré reflua vers moi, ses ailes paralysées, irresponsable, à cheval entre le néant et l'infini, je me mis à pleurer. This desire to rise up from nothingness to the infinite, but finding oneself caught between them, correlates with Fanon's account of his sense of being caught dialectically at every level between being black and being white, being French and not being French. In a footnote, Fanon himself invokes the poet-philosopher Jean Wilde's idea of transcendence that's dialectically correlated to immanence, producing some movement between the two that suggests a form of journey or personal growth. L'Oiseau Noir precipitates us into the existential situation, therefore, of being caught between being black and white, mediated through a preoccupation with nothingness, with mortality and death, with la mort blanche, la hideuse crispation de l'angoisse et de la mort, leading to an assumption into an absolute otherness of inhuman cosmic materiality. The final movement offers a vision of transcendence beyond the exigencies of the oppressive everyday which are left behind, unsupportable self-consciousness, the sense of being caught in this perpetual volleying between nothingness and the infinite. All this is apparently about to be resolved as they step into a form of insentience and immanence. Les Mains Parallèles offers a very different kind of transcendence, the kind that Jean Weil himself described as the first Nietzschean form, that is, the will of overpassing. In Les Mains, this explosive transcendence is situated within a more fully socialized environment, the island of Lesbos, and involves the destruction and remaking of society rather than an individual escape from it. The fierce politics of the rebel in Aimé Césaire's Et les chiens se taisent of 1946 exercises, I think, a major influence on the play. And with Césaire, the influence of Nietzsche. Césaire had discovered in Nietzsche's critique of European culture and its values and his stress on the necessity of self-creation, of new values as a form of self-affirmation, a fulcrum that could be utilized for the colonized person who'd been relegated by the colonizer to the negativity of the position of the so-called inferior or uncivilized. And he developed that further through his anti-rational surrealistic language that broke up the hegemony of standard French. Along with developing that surrealistic linguistic idiom into his own particular visceral verbal style, what Fanon took most from Césaire, I think, was a recognition of the transformative possibilities that Nietzsche held out for the colonized person. The attraction of Nietzsche for Fanon can be understood through Karl Jasper's argument that it's Nietzsche who holds out the possibility that the ressentiment of disempowerment can be reconstructed by the dispossessed into a form of creative empowerment. This reversal, or as Fanon would later put it, transmutation, in some ways, I think, remained the practical basis of Fanon's therapeutic practice and provided the structure of individual and social transformation that he would articulate in Les Damnés de la Terre. Set on the island of Lesbos, which can easily be reimagined as Martinique, though the parallel is never hinted at explicitly, Les Mains stages an Oedipal drama which begins with the anticipation of the wedding day of Epithalos, son of Polyxos and Drana, to Odeline, his bride. For Polyxos, however, the day has begun with bad omens, and he quickly understands that instead of getting married to Odeline, Epithalos intends to kill him. There's no general political situation sketched out for this somewhat bizarre story, killing the father on their wedding day. There's no historical parallel, as Césaire had in his play, where he invokes Toussaint Louverture. There's no implicit allegory alluding to present circumstances, as in Sartre's Les Mouches. Instead, what we have is a play about revolution in itself as a rebellion against an old order that's complicit with the stifling hegemonic power of the gods. A play, you might say, about revolution as such. But Les Mains is not about a young man playing at revolution, as in Paul Nizan's 1938 La Conspiration, the title also of a third play by Fanon, now apparently lost. Nor is it a play about revolutionaries in the sense of a collective action taken against a dominant order. Les Mains is a play about a revolutionary hero who sacrifices himself in order to rid society of 2,000 years of complacent rules. Literally, you might say, in this case, le nom du père. But the drama of the play is less the murder of the ruler itself, which happens off stage and is presented as inevitable, than a concern with the dynamics of revolutionary consciousness and of the act itself. Epithalos is a revolutionary who pays the cost of his superhuman self-assertion. His fierce resolution becomes more equivocal when he sees the consequences of his unleashing death and disorder in the city, and is challenged very assertively by his mother and would-be mother-in-law. Although the resemblance only operates at a general level, we could compare L'Oeil-sur-Noir to Sartre's, compare Les Mains Parallèles to Sartre's 1948 play Les Mains Sales, a political drama about the assassination of a powerful politician, which is also set in a fictional Greece. But while in Sartre's case, the emphasis is placed on the authenticity of the motive of the assassin, in Fanon's play there's no question of the authenticity of the erupting consciousness of Epithalos, and his concern is to utilize the power of his surhumanité to move words into action with the killing of Polyxos. Un acte. Je veux éclabousser ce ciel enceinte d'un acte vertigineuse. Main parallèle d'un acte nouveau fait retentir le monde empesé. Odeline, la parole parvenue aux extrêmes volcaniques s'érige en acte. So driven by his sheer assertive willpower, Epithalos sets off the explosion that Fanon would himself later evoke 4 times in Peau Noire. Remember, it begins, l'explosion n'aura pas lieu aujourd'hui, il est trop tard, trop tôt ou trop tard. But later, he writes, in fact, j'explosais, I exploded. For Epithalos, the time, by contrast to Peau Noire, is absolutely right. Le roc par moi institué précise les explosions. Je force les membrures de ma tranquille profondeur et j'explose, telle certitude finale. So Lemar, you could say, in fact, dramatizes the explosion that haunts Fanon's consciousness in Peau Noire. But after the explosion, after committing the deed and unleashing the apocalyptic destruction on the city, when Epithalos appears in the final act, his tone begins to change. He now becomes haunted by the sight of death, the abyss, and the world. His explosive act has overreached the limit. Particularly when he learns that he's also caused the death of his fiancée, Odaline. It's for this reason that in the face of his mother's and would-be mother-in-law's reproaches about what he's done, Epithalos, at the end, sacrifices himself for the greater good so that a new order can be restored, implicitly by the women of the city. He seems to accept that Lesbos will move from a patriarchal to a matriarchal social society in which he can never participate. The curtain falls as he walks into a volley of bullets and dies. What's important for him, though, is that he's administered some kind of total shock to the society by killing the king. And here I think we can see a strong connection with Fanon's unexpected enthusiasm in the psychiatric writings for electric shock treatment for his patients. The shock, he thought, would move them out of the frameworks which they developed to cope with society's judgment of them as psychotic or mad. Electric shock would erase all that and allow them to start again. The killing of Polyxos seems designed to give a similar kind of shock to the society of Lesbos. Once the act has been committed, society would start again on a new footing. The act or shock will inflict the necessary change. Joby Fanon reports that Fanon didn't know how to end the play. He arrived to stay with him and he'd written all but the last act and he didn't know how to end it. And I think that's a very significant piece of information because the point is, to some degree, that actually it doesn't matter how the play ends. The explosive, surrealistic electric shock has already been administered to society. The act has been committed, and that's what the play is essentially focused on. So the revolution in Les Mains Parallèles turns out to be a social and political form of convulsive therapy. Thank you.